In the dusty corners of grand estates, secrets sleep for decades. But some secrets refuse to stay buried. When 28-year-old William Ashford returned to Ravenshollow Manor to settle his late mother's affairs, he expected nothing more than painful memories and legal paperwork. What he found instead was a yellowed envelope hidden behind a loose floorboard in her childhood bedroom, a document that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his family, his inheritance, and his very identity. The signature at the bottom belonged to his grandmother, Helena Ashford, a woman who had supposedly left him nothing when she died 15 years ago. But this told a very different story. The rain hammered against the leaded windows of Ravenshollow Manor as William Ashford stood in the grand foyer, water dripping from his dark overcoat onto the marble floor. The house felt like a tomb, cold, silent, and heavy with the weight of memories he'd spent years trying to forget. His mother, Lady Catherine Ashford, had been dead for 3 months now, and he'd finally found the courage to return to the estate that had once been his childhood home. The manor sprawled across 3 stories of Gothic architecture, its towers and turrets piercing the gray Yorkshire sky. William remembered running through these halls as a boy, his laughter echoing off the stone walls while his mother chased him, her own laughter mixing with his. Now, the silence was deafening. "Mr. Ashford?" a voice called from the drawing room. "I'm Margaret Thornfield from Thornfield & Associates. We spoke on the telephone." William shook the rain from his coat and walked toward the voice. Margaret Thornfield was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She was seated at his mother's writing desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. "Thank you for coming out in this weather," William said, settling into the chair across from her. "I know this is rather unconventional, meeting here instead of your office." "Not at all," Margaret replied, adjusting her glasses. "Sometimes it's easier to sort through an estate in the place where the deceased lived. Helps provide context." She paused, studying his face. "I was very sorry to hear about Lady Catherine. She was a remarkable woman." William nodded, not trusting his voice. His mother had been everything to him after his father died when William was only 10. She'd raised him alone in this vast house, teaching him about honor, responsibility, and the weight of the Ashford name. But she'd also been secretive about certain aspects of their family history, particularly about his grandmother Helena's death when he was 13. "Shall we begin with the will?" Margaret asked gently. The reading was straightforward. His mother had left him everything: the manor, the surrounding lands, her investments, and personal effects. It was a considerable inheritance, but one that came with massive responsibilities and equally massive debts. The estate had been struggling financially for years, and William wondered if he'd be able to keep it afloat. "There is one peculiar thing," Margaret said, shuffling through her papers. "Your mother left specific instructions about your grandmother's room. She wanted it to remain exactly as it was when Helena died, but she also wanted you to go through it personally. No servants, no outside help. Just you." William frowned. "That's odd. Mother never even spoke about grandmother's room. I haven't been in there since I was a child. Well, according to these instructions, she felt it was important for you to handle it yourself. She said there might be things of sentimental value that only you would recognize." After Margaret left, William found himself standing outside his grandmother's bedroom on the 2nd floor. The heavy oak door bore the Ashford family crest, a raven perched on a sword, carved deep into the wood. He turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered it from his childhood visits. Heavy burgundy curtains blocked most of the light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. The 4-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy draped in rich velvet. Antique furniture lined the walls: a mahogany wardrobe, a dressing table with an ornate mirror, and a small writing desk by the window. Helena Ashford had been a formidable woman, the kind who commanded respect simply by entering a room. She'd died suddenly of a heart attack when William was 13, and his mother had closed off this room immediately afterward. William had always assumed it was too painful for Catherine to deal with her mother's belongings. He began methodically going through the wardrobe first. Helena's clothes still hung there. Elegant dresses from another era, fur coats that smelled faintly of lavender and age. In the pockets, he found old theater tickets, handwritten notes, and a few pieces of antique jewelry. Nothing particularly significant. The dressing table yielded similar results. Perfume bottles with barely any scent left, makeup compacts from decades past, and a collection of hairpins and brooches. William was beginning to think this was just a sentimental exercise his mother had wanted him to go through for closure. Then he moved to the writing desk. The desk itself was locked, but William found the key in a small porcelain dish on top. Inside the drawers were letters, correspondence between his grandmother and various friends, business associates, and family members. Most were routine, but a few caught his attention. There were several heated exchanges with someone named Charles Blackwood, a name William didn't recognize. The letters seemed to be about money, specifically about money that Blackwood claimed was rightfully his. The Ashford fortune was built on deception, one letter read. Helena, you know as well as I do that your late husband's will was contested for a reason. The rightful inheritance belongs to the Blackwood line, and I won't rest until justice is served. Helena's responses were characteristically sharp. Charles, your grandfather lost his claim in court fair and square. My husband's will was legitimate, and no amount of your scheming will change that. Drop this matter before you embarrass yourself further. William sat back in the desk chair, puzzled. He'd never heard any mention of contested wills or disputed inheritances. His grandfather, Robert Ashford, had died before William was born, but according to family stories, the transition of the estate had been seamless. As he continued reading, a clearer picture began to emerge. Apparently, there had been some kind of legal battle in the 1960s over Robert Ashford's estate. Charles Blackwood, whose grandfather had been Robert's business partner, claimed that Robert had promised him a significant portion of the Ashford holdings. The courts had ruled in Helena's favor, but Blackwood had never accepted the decision. William was so absorbed in the letters that he almost didn't notice the small gap between two of the desk's floorboards nearby. Something had been bothering him about the room's layout, and now he realized what it was. The desk seemed to sit slightly off-center compared to the wear patterns on the Persian rug beneath it. Curious, he moved the desk aside. Immediately he saw that one of the floorboards was loose. Using a letter opener from the desk, he pried it up carefully. Underneath was a small cavity, and inside that cavity was a manila envelope, yellowed with age. William's heart began to race as he pulled it out. The envelope was sealed and bore his grandmother's handwriting. For William, to be opened only after Catherine's death. With trembling hands, he broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first thing he saw was a document with last will and testament of Helena Ashford printed at the top. But this wasn't the will he'd heard about during the estate proceedings after his grandmother's death. This was dated 6 months before Helena died, and it was completely different from the will that had been read by the lawyers. According to this document, Helena had left the entire Ashford estate not to Catherine, but to William directly, with the provision that it would be held in trust until he turned 25. Catherine was to serve as trustee and receive a generous annual allowance, but the estate itself was meant to pass to William. But that wasn't all. The will also contained a provision that made William's blood run cold. Should any member of the Blackwood family attempt to claim any portion of this inheritance through legal or illegal means, the full truth about the Ashford-Blackwood business partnership shall be revealed through documents held in Safety Deposit Box 2407 at Yorkshire National Bank under the key held by my solicitor, Harold Pembridge. William read the document 3 times, his mind reeling. If this will was genuine, and the paper, ink, and Helena's distinctive handwriting all suggested it was, then everything about his inheritance had been a lie. His mother had inherited nothing. The estate should have been his 5 years ago when he turned 25. There was more in the envelope. A letter addressed to William in his grandmother's careful script. My dearest William, if you are reading this, then Catherine has passed away and you are finally learning the truth. I pray you can forgive both your mother and me for the deception we felt was necessary. When I was dying, I discovered that Charles Blackwood had not given up his claim to our family's fortune. In fact, he had become quite dangerous in his obsession. He had hired investigators to dig into our family's past, and what they found could have destroyed everything your grandfather built. The truth is that your grandfather Robert did indeed promise Charles's grandfather, Edmund Blackwood, a significant share in their business ventures. But Edmund was also embezzling from their joint accounts and planning to flee the country with money that belonged to both families. Robert had to choose between honoring a partnership with a thief or protecting the future of the Ashford line. He chose us, but he did so by altering some documents and backdating others. It wasn't entirely legal, but it was the only way to save the estate from Edmund's theft. Charles discovered this and threatened to expose the scandal unless he received what he considered his rightful inheritance. The exposure wouldn't just have meant financial ruin, it could have led to criminal charges against Robert's estate and, by extension, against Catherine and eventually you. I made a terrible decision. I created a false will, one that left everything to Catherine, knowing that she would eventually pass it on to you anyway. The real will, the one you're holding now, I hid away. I hoped that Charles would give up his pursuit once I was dead and Catherine was in control of a diminished inheritance. I was wrong. Catherine has been paying Charles Blackwood money for years, hush money to keep him from pursuing his legal claims. It's why the estate has been struggling financially. She's been slowly draining our resources to keep our family's secrets buried. She did this to protect you, William, even though it meant living a lie for 15 years. But Charles is not a man who stays bought. I suspect that after Catherine's death, he will make his move against you. The safety deposit box I mentioned contains all the evidence of the original partnership agreement, Edmund's theft, and your grandfather's response. It also contains evidence of Charles's blackmail attempts against our family. Use this information wisely. The choice of what to do with the truth is now yours. William set the letter down with shaking hands. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his inheritance, and his mother's financial struggles had been turned upside down. His mother hadn't just been a grieving widow trying to maintain an aging estate, she'd been fighting a secret war against a blackmailer for 15 years. The room suddenly felt smaller, the shadows deeper. William understood now why his mother had been so secretive about certain family matters, why she'd always seemed worried about money despite their apparent wealth, and why she'd sometimes gotten strange phone calls that made her pale and anxious. As he sat in his grandmother's chair, surrounded by the evidence of decades of deception and sacrifice, William realized that inheriting Ravenshollow Manor was going to be far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Somewhere out there, Charles Blackwood was probably preparing to make his final move, unaware that William now held the keys to a battle that had been raging in secret for over 60 years. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and William couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The manor's many windows and hidden corners suddenly seemed less like charming architectural features and more like potential threats. If Charles Blackwood had been monitoring his family for decades, he certainly knew that Catherine was dead and that William had returned to claim his inheritance. What William didn't know was whether Blackwood was aware of the real will's existence, or if he was about to walk into a trap that had been set before he was even born. Part 2, William spent the rest of that stormy night reading and rereading his grandmother's letter, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. By morning, he'd made a decision. He needed to find Harold Pembridge, the solicitor mentioned in the will, and get access to that safety deposit box. The telephone directory listed Pembridge and Associates as still operating from offices in York. When William called, he was surprised to learn that Harold Pembridge himself was still alive, though retired, and that the firm was now run by his daughter, Sarah. More importantly, they still had records dating back to Helena's time. Mr. Ashford. Sarah Pembridge said when William arrived at their offices that afternoon, "I've been expecting this call for 15 years. Sarah was a woman in her 40s, with her father's sharp intelligence evident in her green eyes. She led William into a conference room where an elderly gentleman with white hair and a cane was waiting. "This is my father, Harold," she said. "He insisted on being here when you came." Harold Pembridge stood slowly and shook William's hand. His grip was still firm, despite his age. "Your grandmother was one of the most remarkable clients I ever had," he said, "also one of the most troubled by the burden she carried." "Then you know about the real will?" William asked. "I drafted it myself," Harold replied. "I also have the key to safety deposit box 247, as per Helena's instructions. She made me promise to give it to you only after Catherine's death and only if you came asking for it." Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Ashford, before we proceed, I need to ask you something. Have you been contacted by anyone named Blackwood recently?" William shook his head. "No, but I'm expecting that to change soon. My grandmother's letter suggested that Charles Blackwood would make his move after my mother's death." Harold and Sarah exchanged glances. "I'm afraid he already has," Harold said grimly. "Charles Blackwood died 2 years ago, but his son David has taken up the family cause. We've received several letters from David's attorney demanding access to Helena's estate records. We've managed to delay him so far, but his patience is running thin." This was news William hadn't expected. "What does David Blackwood know?" "More than we'd like," Sarah admitted. "His father kept meticulous records of the family's grievances against the Ashfords. David has access to most of the original business documents from the 1960s, and he's hired a very aggressive law firm. They're preparing to file a lawsuit claiming that Helena's will was fraudulent and that the estate should be divided according to the original partnership agreements. But they don't know about the real will?" "No," Harold said, "and they don't know about the safety deposit box." "But William, you need to understand something. The evidence in that box is a double-edged sword. Yes, it proves that Edmund Blackwood was embezzling money, but it also proves that your grandfather altered legal documents to cover it up. In today's legal climate, that could still result in criminal charges or massive civil penalties." William felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. "What would you advise?" "That depends," Sarah said, "on what kind of man David Blackwood is. If he's reasonable, we might be able to negotiate a settlement that acknowledges both families' legitimate claims without airing all the dirty laundry. If he's as obsessed as his father and grandfather were, then we're looking at a very public and very expensive legal battle. I need to see what's in that safety deposit box first," William decided. An hour later, they were at Yorkshire National Bank. The safety deposit box was larger than William had expected, nearly the size of a briefcase. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, and letters dating back to the 1940s. The story they told was more complex than Helena's letter had suggested. Robert Ashford and Edmund Blackwood had been business partners in several ventures, importing, real estate, and manufacturing. The partnership had been very successful until the late 1950s, when Edmund began siphoning money from their joint accounts to fund what appeared to be gambling debts. Robert had discovered the theft, but hadn't confronted Edmund directly. Instead, he'd hired a private investigator to document the embezzlement, while quietly moving assets out of Edmund's reach. When Edmund realized what was happening, he'd threatened to claim that Robert was the one stealing from the partnership. The confrontation had come in 1962, when Edmund demanded a complete buyout of his share of their businesses at far above market value, threatening to destroy Robert's reputation if he refused. Robert had agreed to pay, but only after Edmund signed documents absolving him of all future claims. What Edmund hadn't known was that Robert had evidence of the embezzlement and planned to use it if Edmund ever reneged on their agreement. But Edmund had died in a car accident just weeks after signing the agreements, and his son Charles had inherited not just his father's debts, but also his belief that the Ashfords had cheated his family out of their rightful fortune. Among the documents were copies of checks showing payments from Helena to Charles Blackwood dating back to 1978, just after Helena's death. The amounts had started small, a few £100 here and there, but by the time of Catherine's death, the payments had grown to several £1,000s quarterly. "Your mother paid him over £400,000 over the years," Sarah calculated, reviewing the bank records. No wonder the estate was struggling financially. But the most damaging document was a letter from Charles Blackwood to Catherine, dated just 6 months before her death. "Catherine, my patience has reached its limit. The quarterly payments you've been making are insufficient compensation for what your family stole from mine. When you die, I expect William to honor a more substantial agreement, or I will take my case to the newspapers as well as the courts. The scandal will destroy the Ashford name permanently. You know I have the evidence to prove your father-in-law was a criminal." William felt sick reading it. His mother had been under constant threat, slowly bleeding the family fortune to keep their secrets safe, and now that burden had fallen to him. "There's something else you need to see," Harold said quietly, pulling out a manila folder from the bottom of the box. "This arrived at our office last week, addressed to you specifically. The letter was from David Blackwood, Mr. Ashford. By the time you read this, I assume you've discovered some unpleasant truths about our family's shared history. Unlike my father, I have no interest in prolonged blackmail schemes or gradual payments. I want what's rightfully mine, half of the Ashford estate. As per the original partnership agreements between our grandfathers, you have 2 weeks from the date your mother's will was probated to contact my attorney Marcus Finch to arrange the transfer. If you refuse, I will file criminal charges against your grandfather's estate and civil suits that will tie up your inheritance for decades. I have evidence that will destroy your family's reputation and very likely result in the seizure of Ravenshollow Manor by the Crown. Don't make the same mistakes your mother and grandmother made. End this now. The letter was dated 1 week ago. He's not bluffing, Sarah said grimly. Marcus Finch is one of the most aggressive litigators in England. If David Blackwood has hired him, he's serious about this. William stared at the letter, feeling trapped between impossible choices. If he fought the Blackwood claim and lost, he could face criminal charges and lose everything anyway. If he negotiated, he'd be giving up half of his family's legacy to satisfy what amounted to a sophisticated extortion scheme. What are my realistic options? He asked. Harold leaned back in his chair. Option 1, pay him. Give David Blackwood half the estate and end this permanently. You'd still be wealthy, and you'd avoid the scandal and legal risks. Option 2, William asked. Fight him, Sarah said. Use the evidence of Edmund's embezzlement and Charles's blackmail to argue that any legitimate claims the Blackwood family might have had were forfeited by their criminal behavior. But William, this option is very risky. Modern courts don't look kindly on document alteration, even when it's done to prevent theft. Is there a third option? Harold and Sarah exchanged glances again. Possibly, Harold said slowly. But it would require you to take a significant gamble. What kind of gamble? We could approach David Blackwood directly, not through his attorney, and propose a meeting. If you can convince him that fighting this battle will cost both families more than either of you would gain, you might be able to negotiate a smaller settlement. The key would be making him understand that a public court battle would expose his family's criminal history as well as yours. William considered this. What makes you think he'd be willing to meet? Because, Sarah said, according to our research, David Blackwood isn't wealthy. His father spent most of the family money on legal fees and private investigators over the years. David needs this to pay off, but he also can't afford a prolonged legal battle if it doesn't end in his favor. William made his decision. Set up the meeting. But as they left the bank that evening, William noticed a black sedan that seemed to be following them at a discreet distance. When he mentioned it to Harold, the older man's face grew grave. William, you need to be very careful from this point forward. The Blackwood family has employed some rather unsavory methods in the past to gather information about the Ashfords. If they're having you watched, it means David is more desperate than we thought. That night, back at Ravenshollow Manor, William found himself checking the locks on every door and window. The house felt different now, not like a childhood home, but like a fortress under siege. Every shadow could hide a threat, every phone ring could bring bad news. As he stood in his grandmother's room, looking at the loose floorboard where he'd found the real will, William realized that the next few days would determine not just his financial future, but whether the Ashford family name would survive the scandal that had been brewing for over 60 years. Outside, the black sedan sat parked just beyond the manor's gates, its occupants watching and waiting for the next move in a deadly game that had been playing out for 3 generations. Part 3, the meeting was arranged for the following Thursday at a neutral location, the private dining room of a historic hotel in York. William arrived early, accompanied by Harold Pembridge, and waited nervously as the appointed time approached. David Blackwood entered precisely on time, followed by a man William assumed was Marcus Finch, his attorney. David was not what William had expected. Instead of the bitter, obsessed figure he'd imagined, David appeared to be a well-dressed man in his early 40s, with tired eyes and prematurely gray hair. He looked more like someone carrying a heavy burden than someone thirsting for revenge. Mr. Ashford, David said, extending his hand. I appreciate you agreeing to meet. I was beginning to think your family preferred to conduct all their business through intermediaries. There was no hostility in his voice, which surprised William. Marcus Finch, by contrast, was exactly what William had expected. A sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who looked like he ate opposing counsel for breakfast. I thought it was time we had a direct conversation, William replied, shaking David's hand. This feud has gone on long enough. They sat across from each other at a polished mahogany table. Harold had advised William to let David speak first, to better understand his position and motivations. I suppose you've found some interesting documents in your grandmother's effects, David began. William nodded cautiously. I've learned that our family's history is more complicated than I was led to believe. David smiled grimly. That's putting it diplomatically. Mr. Ashford, I'm going to be direct with you because I think we both deserve to know where we stand. My family has been financially destroyed by this 60-year obsession with seeking justice from yours. My father spent everything, our home, our investments, our family business, pursuing what he believed was our rightful inheritance. This was not what William had expected to hear. Marcus Finch looked uncomfortable, as if his client was revealing too much. I grew up hearing stories about how your grandfather stole our family's fortune, David continued. How the Ashfords were criminals who had cheated us out of millions. When my father died, I inherited not just his legal claims, but also his debts. I'm nearly bankrupt, Mr. Ashford. This lawsuit isn't about greed. It's about survival. William found himself feeling sympathy for this man, which complicated everything. David, may I call you David? I think there are things about our family's history that both of us have been told incorrectly. Such as? William looked at Harold, who nodded encouragingly. Such as the fact that your grandfather was embezzling from the partnership, and that your father spent decades blackmailing my mother and grandmother. Marcus Finch leaned forward sharply. Mr. Ashford, I'd be very careful about making accusations without solid evidence. I have solid evidence, William replied calmly, pulling out a folder of photocopied documents from the safety deposit box. Bank records showing payments from my family to yours, letters from your father threatening exposure if the payments stopped, and financial records proving your grandfather was stealing from the joint accounts. David's face paled as he reviewed the documents. Marcus Finch examined them as well, his expression growing increasingly grim. David, Marcus said quietly, you never told me about any blackmail payments. Because I didn't know about them, David replied, his voice barely above a whisper. My father never mentioned. He told me the Ashfords had refused to acknowledge our claims. He never said they were paying him. William watched David struggle with this revelation. How much do you think your father received over the years? David looked up sharply. I have no idea. Whatever it was, I never saw any of it. We lived modestly. My father always claimed the legal battle was draining our resources. Over 400,000 pounds, Harold said quietly, spread across 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. That would have paid off our house, he said finally. It would have saved our family business. It would have paid for my education without loans. He looked up at William. Where did it go? We don't know, William admitted. But I suspect your father's legal fees and investigation costs were higher than he admitted to you. Marcus Finch cleared his throat. Gentlemen, while this is all very illuminating, it doesn't change the fundamental legal issues at stake. David, your grandfather may have been embezzling, but that doesn't invalidate the original partnership agreements. And Mr. Ashford, your grandfather's response may have been understandable. But document alteration is still document alteration. Which brings us to why we're really here, William said. Marcus is right. Both our families have committed illegal acts. If this goes to court, both our reputations will be destroyed, and the legal costs will consume whatever we're fighting over. David nodded slowly. What are you proposing? William had rehearsed this moment, but actually saying the words was harder than he'd expected. A settlement, not because either of us deserves it, but because continuing this fight will destroy us both. What kind of settlement? William took a deep breath. 200,000 pounds. Enough to get you back on your feet, but not enough to bankrupt me. In exchange, you sign a document agreeing that all claims between our families are settled permanently. Marcus Finch frowned. That's significantly less than half the estate's value. Yes, but it's significantly more than David would receive if the court decides that the Blackwood family's criminal behavior forfeited their right to any claim at all, Harold pointed out. David was quiet for a long time, studying the documents spread across the table. Can I ask you something personal, William? Of course. Do you think my grandfather deserved what happened to him? William considered the question carefully. I think your grandfather made terrible choices that hurt both our families. But I also think my grandfather's response created a cycle of deception and revenge that's poisoned 3 generations of our children. I don't want to pass that legacy on to my own children someday. You have children? Not yet, but I hope to. And I'd rather they inherit a family name that's been cleared of scandal than one that's been dragged through the courts and newspapers. David smiled slightly. That's the first thing either of our families has said that actually makes sense to me. Marcus Finch looked frustrated. David, I think you should take more time to consider this. The original claim could be worth significantly more. Marcus, David interrupted, how much would it cost to fight this in court? My fees alone would be at least £100,000, and that's assuming a relatively quick resolution. If the Ashfords fight aggressively, it could be much more. So even if I won, I might not come out ahead? Well, that depends on yes or no, Marcus. Marcus Finch looked uncomfortable. It's possible that legal fees could consume a significant portion of any judgment. David turned back to William. Make it £250,000 and I'll accept. William felt relief wash over him. Done. But as they shook hands, Marcus Finch's expression suggested that he wasn't finished with this matter. I'll need to review the settlement documents very carefully, he said, and I'll want to examine all the evidence both parties claim to possess. After David and his attorney left, Harold turned to William with a concerned expression. That was almost too easy. I don't trust Marcus Finch. Why not? Because aggressive attorneys like him don't usually walk away from potentially large judgments without a fight. I suspect he's going to try to talk David out of this settlement. William's relief was beginning to fade. What can we do? Get the settlement documents drafted immediately and arrange for David to sign them as soon as possible. If Marcus Finch is going to make trouble, we want the legal agreement in place before he can convince his client to change his mind. But William's instincts told him that the real danger wasn't Marcus Finch changing David's mind. The real danger was that there were still secrets about the Ashford-Blackwood feud that none of them knew, secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. That evening, as William drove back to Ravenshallow Manor, he noticed a black sedan following him again. This time, instead of staying at a discreet distance, it was keeping pace with him directly. When William slowed down, it slowed down. When he sped up, it matched his speed. As he turned onto the private road leading to the manor, William made a decision. Instead of going straight to the house, he turned into a small side road and parked behind a grove of trees. Then he waited. The black sedan drove past slowly, its occupants clearly looking for him. William got a good look at the driver, a man he didn't recognize, and managed to memorize part of the license plate number. When he finally returned to the manor an hour later, William found that someone had been inside. Nothing was obviously missing, but drawers that had been closed were now slightly open. Papers on his desk had been moved, and there were muddy footprints in the hallway that weren't his. Someone was watching him, following him, and now searching his home. The question was whether that someone was working for David Blackwood, Marcus Finch, or a third party with their own agenda in the Ashford-Blackwood affair. As William checked the locks and alarm system, he realized that reaching a settlement with David might not end the danger. In fact, it might be just the beginning of a more dangerous game than anyone had anticipated. Part 4. The settlement documents were ready by Friday afternoon, but when Harold called to arrange the signing, Marcus Finch informed him that David was reconsidering his options and would need more time. William's heart sank. Harold had been right about the attorney's intentions. How much more time? Harold asked. At least a week, Finch replied. My client needs to fully understand the implications of accepting this settlement. After hanging up, Harold turned to William with a grim expression. He's stalling. Either he's found something that makes him think he can get more money, or someone else is influencing this decision. William told Harold about the break-in at the manor and the surveillance he'd noticed. I think there's a third party involved in this. Someone who doesn't want the Ashford-Blackwood feud to end quietly. Any idea who? I've been thinking about that. The break-in was professional. Nothing damaged, no obvious theft. Just a careful search. And the surveillance started before I even met with David. Someone knew I was coming back to the manor and knew what I might find there. Harold frowned. William, there's something I haven't told you. When your grandmother first came to me about the real will, she mentioned that she thought Charles Blackwood wasn't working alone. She suspected he had a partner, someone with connections in the legal community who was helping him build his case. Did she say who? No, but she was convinced that someone had access to legal records that Charles shouldn't have been able to obtain. Someone who could have helped him navigate the court system more effectively than a grieving son should have been able to do alone. William's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed David Blackwood's number. William? It's David. We need to meet immediately. Something's happened. What kind of something? Not over the phone. Can you come to my flat? And William, come alone and make sure you're not followed. David's flat was in a modest neighborhood in Leeds, a far cry from the grand estate his family had once owned. William parked several blocks away and walked, checking frequently to make sure he wasn't being followed. David answered the door quickly and ushered William inside. The flat was small but tidy, and William could see evidence of financial strain. Worn furniture, outdated electronics, and a kitchen that had seen better days. What's so urgent that... William began, then stopped. David's face was bruised, and his left hand was bandaged. What happened to you? David gestured for William to sit down. Last night, someone broke into my flat. When I surprised them, they made it clear that I should forget about any settlement with your family and pursue the full legal claim instead. Did you call the police? With what evidence? They wore masks and they didn't steal anything. They just delivered their message and left. David winced as he moved his injured hand. William, there's something else. Marcus Finch called me this morning and said he'd been contacted by someone claiming to have additional evidence about our family's business dealings. Evidence that could significantly increase the value of my claim. William felt a chill. Did he say who contacted him? No. And when I pressed him for details, he became evasive. He said his source wanted to remain anonymous until we decided how to proceed. David, I think someone is trying to manipulate both of us. Someone who profits from keeping this feud alive. That's what I'm beginning to think, too. David pulled out a manila envelope from his coffee table. Before you arrived, I went through my father's papers more carefully than I had before. I found something interesting. Inside the envelope were bank statements from Charles Blackwood's accounts dating back to the early 90s. They showed regular deposits that were significantly larger than the payments from the Ashford family. Where was this extra money coming from? William asked. That's what I want to know. These deposits continued right up until my father's death, but they're not from your family. Someone else was paying my father a lot more than your family was. William studied the statements. David, what if your father wasn't just blackmailing my family? What if he was working for someone else who wanted to destroy the Ashfords completely? Before David could answer, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both men froze. Expecting someone? William whispered. David shook his head. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Mr. Blackwood, a voice called through the door. This is Detective Inspector Sarah Mills with West Yorkshire Police. I need to speak with you about Marcus Finch. David and William exchanged glances. David went to the door but didn't open it immediately. Can I see some identification? A warrant card was slipped under the door. It looked legitimate. David opened the door to reveal a woman in her 30s with short brown hair and intelligent eyes. Behind her stood a constable in uniform. Mr. Blackwood, I am afraid I have some bad news. Marcus Finch was found dead in his office this morning. We have reason to believe it wasn't an accident. William felt the room spin around him. What happened, and you are? Detective Inspector Mills asked. William Ashford. I'm involved in the legal matter Mr. Finch was handling for David. I see. Mr. Finch appears to have been murdered sometime last night. His office was ransacked, and several files are missing. We understand he was representing you in a dispute with Mr. Ashford's family? David nodded numbly. We were trying to settle out of court. Marcus was handling the negotiations. Was Mr. Finch concerned about his safety? Had he received any threats? Not that he told me about, David replied. But yesterday he mentioned that someone had contacted him with new evidence. He seemed excited about it. Detective Mills made notes in her pad. Do you know who this person was? No. Marcus said they wanted to remain anonymous. Mr. O. Ashford, were you aware of this contact? No, this is the first I'm hearing of it. Detective Mills studied both men carefully. I'm going to need statements from both of you about your recent interactions with Mr. Stretcher, Finch. This appears to be connected to the legal matter you were discussing. As they gave their statements, William's mind was racing. Marcus Finch's death couldn't be a coincidence. Someone had killed him to prevent him from revealing what he'd learned or to stop the settlement between the families from proceeding. But who? And why was it so important that the Ashford-Blackwood feud continue? After the police left, William and David sat in stunned silence. William, David said finally, I don't think this is about our family's old business anymore. I think someone is using our feud as cover for something much worse. I agree. The question is what and who? David pulled out his phone. I'm calling off any legal action against your family. Whatever this is about, I don't want any part of it. That might not be enough, William said. If someone killed Marcus Finch to keep this going, they're not going to stop just because you withdraw your claim. Then what do we do? William made a decision that surprised him. We worked together to find out who's really behind this. Because David, I don't think either of us is safe until we know the truth. That evening, William returned to Ravens Hollow Manor with a new understanding of his situation. The danger wasn't coming from the Blackwood family. It was coming from someone who had been manipulating both families for decades, someone who had profited from their feud and was willing to commit murder to keep it alive. As he walked through the manor's grand halls, William realized that the house itself might hold more secrets than just his grandmother's hidden will. If someone had been orchestrating events for this long, they would have needed access to information about both families, access that might have required inside help. In his grandmother's room, William began a more thorough search. If Helena had suspected a conspiracy, she might have left other clues. Behind the books on her shelf, he found a small notebook filled with names, dates, and observations written in her careful handwriting. One entry, dated just weeks before her death, made his blood run cold. Charles continues to receive instructions from his handler. I believe the blackmail is only part of a larger plan to gain control of both family estates. When Charles realizes he's being used, he will become a liability. I fear what will happen to him then. Must find way to protect William from this when the time comes. William stared at the entry. His grandmother had known that Charles Blackwood was being manipulated by someone else. She'd known that the blackmail was part of a larger conspiracy, and she'd been afraid for William's safety even 15 years ago. The question was, who was Charles's handler, and what was their ultimate goal? As William pondered this, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Mr. Borasi's tale was obscure. Ashford, a voice said when he answered. My name is Edmund Hartwell. I believe you've been looking for me. William's heart began to race. Have I? I was Marcus Finch's anonymous source. I think it's time we met. There are things about your family's history that even you don't know yet. Things that explain why so many people have died to keep them secret. People have died? Your grandmother's heart attack wasn't natural, Mr. Wood. Ashford. Neither was Charles Blackwood's car accident. And Marcus Finch's murder was just the latest in a long line of deaths connected to the Ashford estate. If you want to stay alive long enough to learn the truth, you'll meet me tomorrow night at the old mill on the River Ouse. Come alone and bring your grandmother's notebook. I know you found it. The line went dead, leaving William standing in the dark manor with the terrifying realization that he was trapped in a conspiracy that had been claiming lives for decades, and that everyone he'd trusted, his grandmother, his mother, even David Blackwood, had been pawns in a game whose true stakes were only now becoming clear. The real question wasn't who would inherit the Ashford fortune. The real question was who would survive long enough to claim it.